Hi there. I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice and the sound of rain carry you gently into sleep. Now, then, let's begin. The rooster's crow was not just a signal for the peasant to rise. It echoed through the stone halls of the keep, bouncing off cold walls and iron sconces. For a knight, the morning didn't begin with silence or peace, it began with discipline. The medieval knight, far from the romanticized image of banquets and endless wine, lived a life shaped by duty, prayer, and preparation. And that started with food. But breakfast wasn't what we'd imagine today. In fact, in most of medieval Europe, especially in the early Middle Ages, breakfast was seen as slightly sinful, a sign of gluttony or indulgence. Monks avoided it. Nobles often postponed eating until later. Yet for a knight who might face a day of training hunting or even battle, a small morning meal was often necessary. So what did they eat? Let's picture it, a wooden table, still cool from the night air. A servant lays out a piece of stale rye bread, perhaps soaked in watered-down ale to soften it, alongside a small wheel of cheese, hard-aged, perhaps a bit sharp. No forks, only knives and hands. The knight might sip a weak ale or a diluted wine. Not because he was eager to drink clean water wasn't always available. And boiling water wasn't yet common practice in the home. Ale was safer, and even children drank it. Some wealthier knights, especially in France or the Holy Roman Empire, might enjoy a bowl of pottage oats boiled with milk, sometimes thickened with egg yolk or sweetened with honey. If lucky, a few dried fruits or nuts might be mixed in raisins imported from warmer climates, a handful of almonds from the Mediterranean. But meat rarely in the morning. It was costly, hard to preserve, and saved for more substantial meals. After eating, the knight would typically pray. Faith and food were deeply intertwined. He might thank God for the harvest, for his serfs, for his sword. Then the day would begin, armor to be checked, weapons sharpened, squires trained. In colder months, the breakfast might be heavier, thicker porridge, more cheese, perhaps a slice of yesterday's roast if available. The body needed warmth and fuel. But here's the key. Everything was tied to season, class, and location. A knight in England might start his day with barley bread and smoked fish, while one in southern France had access to olives, figs, and soft goat cheese. Food was regional, practical, and deeply connected to survival. And above all, it was about balance. A knight wasn't just a fighter. He was expected to be lean, disciplined, and in control of his appetites. Eating too much, too richly, was frowned upon. Temperance was a virtue. And even meals reflected that. This wasn't gluttony. This was fuel for a day of duty, loyalty, and the ever-present possibility of war. By midday, the knight had earned his meal. Morning hours were no gentle affair. Whether on the training grounds overseeing the estate or patrolling the countryside, a knight's morning was filled with duty and sweat. Steel wasn't light. Chainmail didn't breathe. And the constant weight of a sword on one hip and responsibility on the other meant that by the time the sun reached its peak, the knight's stomach was ready for more than just stale bread and watered ale. But lunch, or as they called it, dinner, was not taken lightly. This was the main meal of the day, the one where real sustenance was expected, especially for a man bred for combat. So what did the midday meal of a medieval knight look like? First, picture the setting. If the knight was at home, his manor or castle, he might dine in the great hall, a long stone chamber, where light filtered through narrow stained glass, and smoke from the hearth mingled with the smells of roasted meat and stewed vegetables. If he was traveling, his meal would be eaten outdoors, or in a tent prepared by his squire or cooks on the road. But regardless of location, the knight would not eat alone. He might dine with fellow nobles' squires, and sometimes even visiting clergy. Meals were both sustenance and ceremony. The food. It all started with bread. Not the fluffy white loaves we know today, but coarse dark loaves made from barley, rye, or oats. The wealthier the knight, the whiter the bread. White flour required more refining and labor, and thus more coin. But even the coarsest bread had a role. Sometimes it served as the trencher, a thick slice placed under meat and stew, soaking up juices before being eaten or given to the poor. Next came pottage, the staple dish of medieval Europe. Imagine a thick stew grains like barley or wheat boiled slowly with vegetables, herbs, and whatever protein could be spared. For the night meat was expected. A rabbit caught in the morning into the pot, salted pork from the cellar. Stir it in, a bit of beef or even some chicken, a luxury but a welcome one. And here's something surprising: spices. Not just salt and pepper, but saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. These were exotic and expensive, imported from the East, along trade routes that stretched through Italy and into the Levant. A well-to-do knight might flaunt his wealth by spicing his stew with ingredients that had traveled farther than most people ever would. Of course, there were roasted meats, and not just any meat. Venison, boar, goose, pheasant. Whatever had been hunted, trapped, or gifted from another noble's estate. These were not always fresh. Meat preservation was tricky. Smoking, salting, and drying were common, but they couldn't stop time. So the strong spices. They didn't just show off status, they helped mask questionable odors. Fish was another option, especially on Fridays or holy days when meat was forbidden. Pike eel or trout caught from local rivers or stocked fish ponds. Eels were especially popular, not slimy table trash as we might see them today, but prized fatty delicacies cooked in wine or stewed with herbs. And what about vegetables? Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did eat their greens. Onions, leeks, cabbage, parsnips, turnips, all boiled, stewed, or served alongside meat. Salads rare, and usually wilted or cooked. Raw vegetables were seen as suspicious too, cooling to the body, some believed. Everything was filtered through a lens of humoral theory. Was it hot or cold, moist or dry? Knights believed that balancing these qualities kept their bodies strong and their minds sharp. Then came cheese, usually hard-aged salty, a way to preserve milk and add protein. Butter was more common in Northern Europe, olive oil farther south. Fruit might be offered next: apples, pears, cherries, even dried figs or prunes, but not fresh fruit. In large quantities, it too was seen as risky to digestion. To wash it all down, ale, of course, but stronger than breakfast ale, closer to what we'd call beer today. Sometimes wine, especially in the warmer climates or among the upper class. Wine was often mixed with water or flavored with herbs and honey. Drinking plain water, that was for the desperate. Unsafe. Dangerous. Even cold water was thought to upset the stomach. But let's talk about how they ate. Forks weren't common yet. A knife in one hand, bread in the other. You cut, you scooped, you dipped. Everyone had their own drinking cup, usually made of wood horn or pewter, and manners. They existed, but were different. Don't blow your nose on the tablecloth. Don't speak with your mouth full. Share what you can. Respect the host. For a knight, chivalry extended beyond the battlefield. Meals were also spiritual affairs. A prayer before eating. A moment of silence. Food was not just pleasure. It was a gift. And if a guest was at the table, hospitality was sacred. Even if the knight disliked him, he would eat beside him, serve him, toast him. Once the meal ended, Leftovers were sometimes gathered and given to the poor. Bones were tossed to the dogs. Bread trenchers soaked with meat juices might be passed to the servants, or in some cases saved for another meal. But one thing was clear by the end of the midday meal: the knight was no longer just a man in armor. He was fueled for whatever came next: training, diplomacy, judgment, even war. For in the medieval world, lunch wasn't just food. It was power, prestige, proof of one's place in the world. As the sun dipped below the hills and the shadows grew long over the manor grounds, the castle stirred once more. Not with battle horns or training cries, but with the quieter sounds of domestic rhythm, crackling hearths, creaking doors, and the soft echo of boots on stone floors. It was time for supper. Unlike the hearty midday feast, the evening meal of a medieval knight was typically lighter, calmer, and often more reflective. This wasn't just about feeding the body, it was about winding down the day, digesting not only the food, but also the responsibilities, decisions, and perhaps regrets of the hours past. Supper was a pause in the rhythm of duty, a time when even a hardened warrior could breathe. But make no mistake, just because it was lighter didn't mean it was unimportant. In fact, for many knights, especially those of noble blood, the evening meal could be a stage, a political gathering, a moment of strategy disguised as social grace. So, what did it look like? Let's begin with the setting. Picture a candle-lit hall, quieter than during the midday meal, but no less grand. Tapestries swayed gently in the cool breeze from slit windows, and the fire offered a soft glow against the stone walls. A few retainers stood nearby, alert, respectful, silent. The knight, now free of his armor, wore a wool tunic or velvet robe, depending on the season and his wealth. He was cleaner now, perhaps, after a wash basin brought to his chamber hands perfumed lightly with lavender or rosemary water. The food, simpler than dinner, but still deliberate. Perhaps a small loaf of bread, to begin lighter than the dark rye from earlier, possibly spiced with herbs. A bowl of broth chicken mutton or fish, depending on what remained from the day's hunt. Broths were important in the evening, warm, easy to digest, and believed to balance the humors after a long day's exertion. On better days, there might be meat pies baked earlier and reheated stuffed with minced pork game, or even fish blended with onions and herbs. The crust was often thick, not always meant to be eaten, but to keep the inside warm. A knight who could afford a skilled cook might enjoy pies laced with saffron or filled with exotic raisins and pine nuts brought in by merchants. Eggs were common, boiled fried in lard, or mixed into a custard-like dish with milk and honey. And if the knight was lucky or politically well-connected, a dish of imported fruits might appear: dried apricots, figs, or candied orange peel from the Mediterranean. These weren't eaten in large quantities, but savored slowly, like treasure, more for pleasure than hunger. Some knights favored roasted root vegetables, parsnips, leeks, carrots, all seasoned with vinegar or spices. Cheese made another appearance, this time softer, more indulgent. And of course ale or wine, though, in moderation. A knight needed clarity even at night. Now let's talk about why this meal mattered. Supper wasn't just about nourishment. It was about conversation, subtle, strategic, and often laced with meaning. Fellow knights' vassals, even visiting merchants or clergy, might join the table. Over simple dishes, they discussed alliances, land disputes, marriage offers, and even the movement of rival lords. It was here, not on the battlefield, that many of the era's most important decisions were first whispered. And sometimes, supper was even more intimate. A knight might eat alone with his wife, speaking in hushed tones of household matters, taxes, or the health of their children. Or perhaps with his squire offering quiet mentorship between bites. And then there were nights when the knight sat alone, staring into the hearth, a cold trencher before him, his thoughts louder than any meal could silence. The evening also brought spiritual ritual. Before eating, many knights prayed not just out of faith, but out of duty. Gratitude for surviving the day. Forgiveness for actions taken in haste. A knight was not only a warrior, but a Christian expected to show humility even while wielding deadly steel. Some might invite a traveling monk or friar to bless the table, or read a passage from the Psalter. Music was not uncommon. A lute, a flute, or a bard's voice might fill the quiet after supper. Songs of chivalry, of distant lands, of tragic love, or glorious conquest. For a few moments, even the hardest knight could be moved not by steel or blood, but by melody. And then slowly, the table would empty. Servants would clear away bowls and cups. The fire would be banked for the night. The knight might take a walk along the battlements or retire to his private chamber. No screens, no books in most cases, just candlelight and silence. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a letter dictated to a scribe, and maybe a final sip of watered wine before bed. Supper had done its job, not just feeding the knight's body, but reminding him of his place in a world that was equal parts violent and sacred. For in the medieval world, how you ended the day mattered. It was a reflection of who you were, your discipline, your grace, your strength. And in a time when life was fragile and tomorrow was never guaranteed, the last meal of the day was a quiet act of both defiance and faith. There were days in a knight's life that broke the rhythm of war duty and discipline. Days when the cold stone halls echoed not with orders or marching boots, but with laughter music and the clatter of goblets raised high in celebration. On those rare occasions when a knight sat not as a servant of battle, but as an honored guest or hero of the hour, he ate not for fuel, but for glory. Welcome to the medieval feast, a moment when a knight could finally eat like a king. Feasts weren't everyday affairs. They were reserved for victories in battle royal visits, weddings, religious holidays, or the birth of a noble heir. And when one was announced, it was as if time itself bent around it. Servants hustled for days. Game was hunted. Ale was brewed. And cooks, real masters of fire and flavor, prepared for an unforgettable display of culinary extravagance. Picture the great hall now, but not as it looked during supper. The long wooden tables are decorated with embroidered cloth. Tapestries are freshly brushed. Candles line the walls, casting a golden glow over polished goblets and platters. In the center, perhaps a tapestry of the knight's coat of arms or his lord's banner hangs above the high table. As guests arrived, lords, ladies. Fellow knights visiting abbots, they were often greeted with a cup of spiced wine or mead sweet and heady. And then, with music rising and anticipation thick in the air, the first course was served. A true medieval feast had multiple courses, often 3 to 5, but each course included many individual dishes. The variety was not just about taste, it was a statement, a display of wealth reach and cultural refinement. So what kind of food could a knight expect on such a grand night? Let's begin with the centerpiece meat. And not just a roast duck or leg of lamb, though those were present. We're talking whole roasted boars, their mouths stuffed with apples, and bodies seasoned with pepper cloves and rosemary. Swan dressed in its own feathers after cooking. Peacocks flamboyantly served with skin and tail feathers, reattached after roasting more for spectacle than flavor. For the wealthiest lords, even dolphin, crane, or porpoise might appear on the table cooked with exotic sauces from the Mediterranean world. Then came the pottages and stews, but unlike the humble versions eaten daily, these were elevated. boiled with almond milk, saffron ginger, and sweetened with sugar, then still a luxury good imported from the East. Meatballs made of minced pork and currants. Fish pies seasoned with raisins, cloves, and lemon. A knight at feast wasn't eating just to fill his belly, he was tasting the known world. And yes, vegetables appeared too usually boiled with butter or cream, served in sauces made from wine or vinegar. Artichokes, spinach beans, and turnips all had their place. But they were supporting roles. In a culture where meat equaled status, vegetables were rarely the stars. Breads came in abundance. Trenchers for the common guests, finer white loaves for the noble table. Served warm paired with creamy cheese, fresh butter, and thick fruit pastes made from quince or plum. Then there were the subtleties, sculpted edible art, made from sugar paste dough or almond flour. Shaped into castles, dragons' knights, or saints, and painted with colored dyes and gold leaf. These weren't meant to be eaten. They were meant to impress, to leave guests speechless. And for the night, they were a visual reminder this night was something rare. Between courses, entertainers roamed minstrels, jesters, poets, and even trained animals. Some feasts had mock duels for sport, or recitals of epic tales, especially if the feast honored a returning knight or a victorious battle. Imagine sitting with a goblet of wine, the scent of roasted goose in the air, while a bard recited your own name in verse telling tales of your deeds to the crowd. And speaking of drink wine, flowed freely. Strong red wines from Bordeaux or Burgundy, sweet white wines from the Rhine, spiced meads and dark ales. At feasts, the rules relaxed. Laughter grew louder. Toasts were shouted. Cups clinked across the table. But not everyone got drunk. A true knight raised in chivalry knew restraint. He drank, but with control. He laughed, but did not mock. Feasts were opportunities to display not only appetite, but character. And when it came time for dessert, the table lit up with rich delights, tarts filled with cream, and berries, honey cakes, marzipan fruits, candied nuts, and even gold-dusted apples. Sugar was treasure. If it was served, it meant something. A gift, a gesture, a symbol. Finally, the feast closed with one last prayer, a nod to humility in the face of such abundance. For a night, everything, every battle, every meal was under God's gaze. As the candles burned low and the hall dimmed, some knights remained sharing stories by the fire, challenging one another to riddles or chess, or quietly sipping wine in silence. Others slipped away, bellies full, and spirits lifted returning to their chambers under the moonlit towers of stone. For tomorrow, the sword would be drawn again. The training would resume. The hunger would return. But for one night, just one, the knight had eaten like a king. When the horns of war blew and banners rose on the horizon, the comforts of castle life disappeared. The feasts, the warm hearths, the silver goblets, and roasted boar, all of it was left behind. What remained was cold steel, sore feet, and a question that every knight faced day after day: how do I eat when the world is burning? Because war was not just fought with swords, it was fought with stamina. And food was fuel. A knight on campaign didn't ride alone. He traveled with his squire, a small retinue of men-at-arms, and if he was wealthy, a baggage train of cooks, grooms, and servants. But even then, supplies were limited. Campaigns moved fast. Roads were rough. The land didn't always cooperate. And so the knight had to survive on what could be carried, what could be foraged, or what could be taken. Let's start with the basics: bread. It was everywhere. Hard, dry, dense loaves, baked before departure, usually made from rye or barley, since those lasted longer. Some were twice baked, turning into something more like biscuit or rusk. These loaves could survive weeks on the road, though they became nearly inedible without soaking. Knights would often dip them in broth ale or wine to soften them. Sometimes they were rubbed with garlic or onion just to mask the taste of staleness. Next came salted meat, the backbone of any military ration. Pork and beef were heavily salted, dried, or smoked before campaigns began. Imagine thick slabs of meat packed in barrels of coarse salt, drawn out weeks later, still edible, but tough and intensely salty. These cuts were boiled in water or ale to remove some of the salt and soften the flesh. If spices were available, pepper, mustard, parsley, they were added. But often the knight ate it plain. Cheese was also essential. Hard wheels made from sheep or goat's milk traveled well and provided protein and fat. It wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Now let's talk about pottage. The one dish that followed the knight everywhere. If there was a fire, a pot, and something to throw in it, there was pottage. Made from lentils, oats, or barley, with any combination of vegetables, dried peas, herbs, or scraps of meat. The knight's cook might throw in foraged greens, wild garlic nettles leeks, or pieces of congealed fat scraped from a salted pork barrel. It wasn't pretty, but it was warm. And in a world of wind, mud, and steel, warm meant everything. Of course, a knight didn't always eat from his own stores. Many relied on pillaging. When armies marched through enemy territory, they foraged, sometimes forcibly. Chickens, grain, even wine were taken from peasant homes or abandoned villages. This wasn't seen as dishonorable, it was war, but it wasn't always reliable. If a land had already been picked clean by another army, or if it had suffered drought or plague, there was nothing to take. And then hunger followed. Let's not forget fish. In regions near rivers or the sea, smoked or dried fish became part of the ration. Cod, herring, or eels were salted and packed in barrels. Monasteries often provided fish on Fridays or holy days when meat was forbidden, even during war. Sometimes knights carried small fishing hooks, though finding time to fish during a siege was rare. And what about drink water when found was often unsafe. Stagnant pools and contaminated streams could spread disease. So instead, knights drank ale or wine carried in leather flasks or wooden casks. These were lower in alcohol and safer than water. Mead, a honey-based alcohol, might also appear in noble circles. Some knights even flavored their drink with herbs, rosemary, mint, or thyme to help with digestion or ward off illness. Fruit only when in season. Apples and pears were eaten fresh or dried. Berries, if found in the wild, were collected in haste. Dried figs and dates were rare but prized. Some noble knights carried small bags of nuts or raisins for energy easy to store and rich in calories. But here's the truth. Many knights went hungry. Sieges could last for months. Battles could cut supply lines. Horses would die. Wagons would get stuck in the mud or stolen by raiders. And when food ran out, even knights suffered. They would kill their own livestock. They would eat thin broth made from boiled bones. They would share crusts of bread, the last piece of cheese, a single egg, divided among 3 men. In extreme cases, there are even tales whispered but real of armies resorting to eating horseflesh dogs or worse. And yet, even in these conditions, a knight maintained rituals. He prayed before meals. He sat apart from his lower-ranking men, even if they were all eating the same thing. He often ate with his squire beside him, sometimes in silence, sometimes in whispered strategy. Meals were still moments of discipline, even dignity, amid the chaos of war. And when a battle was won and the dead were buried or ransomed, the food changed again, at least briefly. Victorious knights were rewarded with banquets even on the field. Roasted game from local forests. Wine seized from enemy stores. sometimes even freshly baked bread, courtesy of grateful townsfolk or surrendered soldiers. But those moments were fleeting, because war did not stop for long. And the knight knew the next meal might be cold, might be hard, might be nothing at all. And yet he rode on, because that was the code. In the medieval world, food wasn't just nourishment, it was moral territory. Every bite, every sip, every indulgence or restraint, these were not private choices. They were reflections of one's soul. For the knight whose entire identity was built on the fusion of martial strength and Christian virtue, what he ate and what he didn't eat was just as important as how he fought. Because the church watched everything, and the church had rules. A true Christian knight was expected to live not just with honor, but with humility. He was a warrior for God after all. He wielded a sword to protect the faith, to uphold the righteous, but he also had to bow to it. And in the world of medieval faith, that meant embracing fasting. Let's start with the calendar. A knight's year was peppered with holy days, saints' days, and fasting seasons. The most significant was Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. During Lent, knights were forbidden from eating meat. That meant no pork, no beef, no game. In many cases, dairy and eggs were also off limits. Imagine a knight who trained daily, managed lands, maybe even prepared for war, yet was expected to power himself on fish, vegetables, and bread alone. And Lent wasn't the only fasting season. There was Advent before Christmas, Ember Days, which came 4 times a year, Rogation Days, when prayers were offered for crops, plus Fridays, which were nearly always meatless, and Wednesdays and Saturdays during stricter periods. That's nearly half the year where eating meat was either restricted or forbidden altogether. So what did the knight eat when the church said no? Let's begin with the most obvious substitute: fish. Fish was the medieval solution to fasting. It wasn't considered meat because it came from the water, not the land. Knights, especially those living near rivers or the sea, relied heavily on fish during fasting seasons. They ate pike trout, eels, and herring, often dried, salted, or smoked. Monasteries were major sources of fish, and many noble households had their own fish ponds stocked with carp or tench for religious use. Shellfish. Surprisingly, yes. Mussels, oysters, and even barnacles were consumed sometimes in large quantities during fasts. They were cheap, plentiful, and acceptable by church standards. In fact, the medieval church could be surprisingly flexible. Over time, religious orders and noble households developed elaborate fish-only feasts that looked suspiciously indulgent. Fish would be cooked in wine, stuffed with nuts and raisins, or fried in expensive oils. Almond milk, made by grinding almonds into a paste and mixing it with water, replaced cream in sauces and stews. Fish bacon. Yes, it existed, was made from dried and smoked whale blubber. There were even records of beaver tails being classified as fish by certain church authorities because the tail was scaly and spent time in water. So yes, beaver could be eaten during Lent. Next came vegetables and grains. The knight might eat bowls of pottage flavored with onions, leeks, and herbs. He might have lentils, peas, or chickpeas boiled with olive oil and vinegar. Bread remained ever present, though often less enriched, no eggs, butter, or animal fat. A truly devout knight might even skip the rich stews and simply eat dry bread and water by choice as an act of penance. And then there was fasting at war. Here the rules grew murky. The church preached that knights were God's defenders, but war was exhausting, and hunger could be fatal. Many knights received dispensations to eat meat during campaigns, even during Lent, especially if no other food was available. Priests traveled with armies and would often grant permission to bend the rules. After all, what good was a starving knight on the battlefield? Still, many knights tried to maintain the discipline. They would abstain when they could pray before meals, and even offer their hunger as a form of spiritual sacrifice. Some wore hair shirts beneath their armor. Some practiced self-flagellation, believing that pain and hunger purified the soul. And on the opposite end of fasting stood feasting, especially on Easter or Christmas when the restrictions were lifted. Knights often celebrated these holy days with lavish meals, not just out of joy, but because they had spent weeks denying themselves. These feasts were part celebration, part spiritual release. But here's something deeper. For the night fasting was about control. Control of appetite, control of emotion, control of the body. It was about proving that he wasn't just a killer in armor, but a servant of something greater. That even when his sword was sharp, his pride was not. That even when hunger clawed at his gut, his soul was stronger. Food was never just food. It was a test. A knight could slay a dozen enemies and still fall in the eyes of the church if he failed to tame his own desires. Gluttony was a sin. So was greed. And temperance wasn't just preached, it was expected. So when you picture a knight kneeling at an altar sword by his side, hands folded in prayer, know that hunger might be gnawing at him too, and that he welcomed it. Because a true knight did not feast for pleasure. He fasted for God. Centuries have passed since the last true medieval knight walked the halls of a stone keep, or rode through a muddy battlefield in armor, glinting under the sun. The castles now stand in ruins or have been turned into museums. The code of chivalry has become legend. But one question still fascinates historians, chefs, and curious minds alike. What did a knight really eat, and can we taste it today? Reconstructing the diet of a medieval knight is like piecing together a mosaic from scattered stones. The colors are faded, the patterns incomplete. But thanks to surviving manuscripts, kitchen records, archaeological finds, and even cookbooks written in Middle English or Latin, we're slowly pulling back the curtain on a forgotten table. Let's begin with the books. One of the most valuable sources is a collection of medieval cookbooks, like the Form of Cury, compiled in the late 14th century by the master cooks of King Richard II of England. This manuscript contains recipes not only for the royal elite, but also dishes that knights and nobles may have eaten at grand feasts. Other texts, such as Le Ménagier de Paris or Libro de Arte Coquinaria, give insight into food preparation in France and Italy, and often blend practical advice with moral instruction, because, as we've seen, food was never just food. But reading a medieval recipe is like decoding a riddle. There are no exact measurements, no oven temperatures. Often ingredients are vague, a handful of herbs or enough water to cover, and many items are named differently than today. Spices like grains of paradise or galingale were common then, but are rare now. Even the word meat didn't always mean what we think it could refer to food in general. Still, modern chefs and historians have risen to the challenge. In kitchens from London to New York, experimental cooks have recreated medieval meals from these ancient texts. Pottages are simmered over open fires. Venison pies are baked in thick crusts. Almond milk is hand-ground from soaked nuts. Fish is preserved in salt and rehydrated before stewing. And yes, trenchers' thick slabs of bread used as plates are baked the old-fashioned way, coarse dark, and designed to soak up every last drop. But to truly understand a knight's diet, we must go beyond the cookbook. We must dig. Archaeologists have excavated the remains of medieval kitchens, pantries, and even toilets. Yes, toilets. What we eat leaves behind evidence seeds, bones, charcoal broken pots. At sites like castles in England, in Germany, archaeologists have found the remains of deer antlers, boar tusks, oyster shells, chicken bones, and charred barley grains. These remnants confirm what the manuscripts suggest. Knights ate a mix of domestic and hunted meats, grains, legumes, and plenty of ale. Even human remains tell a story. Isotope analysis of medieval skeletons reveals what people ate during their lifetimes. Knights, being of higher status, often show higher levels of animal protein than peasants. They were taller, stronger, and had more access to milk meat and imported goods. But they also had more dental decay, likely from eating rich, sweetened foods. Sugar may have been a symbol of wealth, but it also came with a price. Some museums and reenactment groups have gone even further. At places like the Royal Armouries in Leeds or the Château de Castelnau in France, historical interpreters dress in full knightly gear, live by medieval rules, and yes, eat like knights. They roast meat over fire pits, grind spices with mortar and pestle, and serve food on wooden trenchers or pewter plates. Visitors can watch and sometimes even taste a true medieval meal reconstructed with as much authenticity as modern knowledge allows. And then there's the rise of YouTube historians and medieval cooking channels. From small home kitchens to high-end culinary labs, passionate individuals are filming their attempts to cook and eat like people did 700 years ago. Some focus on accuracy sourcing rare spices using medieval techniques. Others aim for approachability, translating old recipes into something you can make with a modern stove and grocery store ingredients. But all of them share one thing: a desire to reconnect with the lost flavors of the past. So what's the verdict? What does a knight's diet actually taste like? It's earthy, hearty, and often surprisingly complex. Pottage, for instance, may sound dull, but when spiced with pepper, saffron, and herbs, it's deeply satisfying. Roasted goose with a clove glaze. Rich and aromatic. A stew made from lentils, garlic, onions, and ale-simmered venison. Comforting, like a cross between a modern chili and a medieval feast. Even simple dishes like rye bread with aged cheese and a bit of honey carry the weight of centuries. It's not just about flavor, it's about connection. Eating like a knight isn't about cosplay or nostalgia. It's about understanding how people lived, how they found joy and strength in simplicity, how their meals reflected their values, faith, honor, survival, and community. In a world of fast food and plastic packaging, there's something grounding about picking up a knife and loaf of barley bread, spooning thick stew from a wooden bowl, and sipping ale by firelight. It reminds us that we're not so different from those who came before. We eat to live, but we also eat to remember. And through food, humble, hearty, honest food, we can taste history itself. And so we reach the final course, not of a meal, but of a journey. We've followed the night from dawn to dusk, through battlefield hunger and banquet indulgence, through religious sacrifice and culinary rediscovery. But now, with the fire growing dim and the castle quiet, it's time to ask a quieter question. What does a knight's diet really tell us about us? At first glance, the food of a medieval knight might seem distant, strange, even primitive. No refrigerators, no forks, no recipes, written in tidy bullet points. No supermarkets filled with plastic-wrapped portions or glowing apps that bring food to your door. And yet, strip it all away, and what remains feels deeply familiar. Because underneath the coarse rye bread and thick pottage lies a timeless truth: food is identity. A knight didn't just eat to fill his belly. He ate to show the world who he was. A humble morning meal whispered of discipline. A midday feast spoke of duty, strength, and status. An evening supper reflected thought, restraint, perhaps even a prayer. And the grand feasts, oh, those were more than food. They were storytelling in flavor power on a platter hierarchy baked into pastry. But alongside that identity sat something quieter, something softer. something we still crave today. Connection. A knight rarely ate alone. Meals were shared with squires, comrades, wives, lords, even rivals. Around the table, glances were exchanged, words, carefully chosen hands, extended in peace or promise. Over bread and broth deals were struck. Lives were changed. Even in war, with frostbitten fingers and a crust of salted meat, the knight ate surrounded by others. Because the table, whether carved from oak or shaped from dirt, was always more than a place to eat. It was a place to belong. And what about us? In our modern world, food is faster than ever. We eat while driving, while scrolling, alone in quiet rooms in front of glowing screens. We've gained convenience, but sometimes lost ritual, lost meaning. Maybe that's why we're drawn to the knight's table. Not because we want to trade places, but because something about that world, rough as it was, feels more grounded, more deliberate, more human. There's beauty in that simplicity. A pot of lentils slowly simmered, a loaf of dark bread torn and shared, a moment of silence before the first bite. The understanding that hunger is not just physical, but also emotional, spiritual. A knight knew that. Even surrounded by stone and steel, he knew food was more than fuel. It was story. It was culture. It was care. And maybe tonight, as you finish this journey, that lesson lingers. Maybe your next meal will feel just a little more sacred. Maybe you'll take an extra moment to notice the warmth in the bowl, the hands that prepared it, the memory it carries. Because when you sit down to eat, truly eat, you're not just feeding yourself. You're participating in something ancient, something a knight would have understood. Thank you for traveling back in time with us through kitchens of stone fields of battle and halls of forgotten glory. If this journey stirred something in you, curiosity, wonder, or simply a bit of gratitude, consider joining us again. There are more stories waiting, more forgotten lives, lost flavors, and distant echoes ready to be heard. But for now, let the fire burn low. Let the armor rest. The night has eaten, and so have we. Good night, and may your next meal be shared in good company.